Cuba, placing the world on the verge of atomic war.
The fall of 1962. Though hurricane season, on the surface, the Caribbean island of Cuba is an idyllic paradise. Its jungles course with snakes and rivers alongside mangrove swamps and a titanic mountain range. Yet, just like Selinoyarsk, the setting for Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid 3, the lush canopies of this Edenic paradise camouflage a dark, apple-scented secret. New types of Soviet nuclear weapons have been snuck inside, in one of the largest secret operations of the Cold War. And just like that, Cuba, this remote, ostensibly unimportant region outside either superpower's borders, will now decide the difference between war and peace, a mutual destruction and continued coexistence. Welcome back to our retrospective on Metal Gear Solid 3: Existence. We'll be continuing our discussion this episode of that most central subject for the game, the Cold War, taking an in-depth look at the Cuban Missile Crisis like you've never seen it before. One, Denial and Deception, Maskirovka. They called it Operation Anadyr after a Russian river that flows into the Bering Sea. Officially, the Cuban-bound convoy of 86 ships traveling from ports across the Soviet Union contained nothing but agricultural equipment, civilian workers, and concerned students. In reality, they concealed a massive campaign of denial and deception, Maskirovka. Aboard these cramped freighters were tens of thousands of Cuba-bound Soviet soldiers, and they weren't alone. With them were a staggering array of nuclear weapons. What they'd lead to, historian Arthur Schlesinger has called the most dangerous moment in human history. About a year ago, in the infamous Bay of Pigs incident, America had been caught red-handed failing to secretly overthrow the communist dictatorship of Fidel Castro. That had coincided with Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin beating the US to space. The space race and arms race went hand in hand. Both Gagarin's Vostok 1 and the earlier unmanned Soviet satellite Sputnik had used variants of the multi-cluster engine rocket known as the R-7 Semyorka, or Little 7. The R-7 was the first intercontinental ballistic missile in history. And in the MGS universe, it was designed by the Soviet engineer Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov. Sokolov was likely based on Russian scientist turned dissident Andrei Sakharov. Though considered father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, given his responsibility for the first two-stage such device for the Russians in 1955, Sakharov later became an important voice among the anti-proliferation movement in the Soviet Union. In 1958, East and West had agreed to a moratorium on nuclear testing. Khrushchev broke that agreement in September 1961. The Americans would follow suit in April of 1962. That meant for the months leading up to the coming crisis in Cuba, the superpowers had been engaging in weekly, if not daily, back-and-forth nuclear demonstrations. The Cold War was heating up, and that caused Sakharov, just like Sokolov, to panic. We'll discuss Sakharov in greater detail next time. Sakharov called further atmospheric testing a crime against humanity, but Khrushchev was unmoved. The bomb was fundamental to Russia's status as superpower. Nothing was considered more important. Unlike Sakharov, on October 9, 1962, Sokolov in the MGS universe defected to the West. It is implied that the ensuing missile crisis is directly related to this event. Sokolov defected via Berlin, widely considered at the time the most dangerous place on Earth. The situation there had been heating up throughout most of JFK's presidency. In 1961, to stem the flow of refugees into West Berlin, Khrushchev had built 104 miles of border wall, dubbed by the East the anti-fascist defense barrier, but known in the West as simply the Berlin Wall. For 2 days in October that year, at the infamous border crossing Checkpoint Charlie, Soviet and American tanks had entered a standoff. Ever since, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev has wanted the West to relinquish control over West Berlin. Khrushchev believes the Bay of Pigs and other events have exposed American President John F. Kennedy as a lightweight. With Cuba, Khrushchev senses an opportunity. Much of the American activity on Cuba throughout the crisis would become familiar to fans of MGS3, chasing down secret Soviet nuclear weapons and stealthily sabotaging the enemy, in 1 Minute to Midnight's words, as an instrument of policy. For years, the CIA had been undermining Castro in a covert campaign named Operation Mongoose. That poking and prodding had evidently now triggered a confrontation, one Khrushchev wrongly believed JFK was too weak-kneed to respond to. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, was committed to checking Soviet expansion. Back in 1959, America handed its first medium-range ballistic missile, the PGM-19 Jupiter, to NATO member Turkey. Encircled by NATO countries, now something of a prisoner within his own sphere of influence, Khrushchev eyes those Turkish Jupiters with disdain. Operation Anadyr will be Khrushchev's retaliation. In trying to better balance the distribution of nuclear power, ironically, Khrushchev was merely fulfilling what none other than Winston Churchill had dubbed the equality of a mutually assured destruction. In that amazing Russian multi-cluster engine, the R-7 Semyorka, or Little 7, several smaller propulsion units did the job of a single large one, allowing the Russians to leap over their own technical limitations with great ingenuity. Something similar was now afoot in Cuba. In public, Khrushchev declared his country was producing nuclear warheads like sausages, which he claimed could hit a fly in space. This was nothing more than a ruse. Despite American fears of a so-called missile gap, the Soviet arsenal, far smaller than America's, really consisted mainly of medium-range ballistic missiles like the Jupiter, or MRBMs. Lacking the requisite range to threaten the American homeland, these were designed instead as defensive weapons to check the growing arsenals of NATO in Western Europe. But by breaking up medium, intermediate, and close-range nuclear platforms and weapons into components, then shipping them surreptitiously to Cuba piece by piece, Khrushchev, still with those same old nukes, now possessed the equivalent deterrent power of an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. Even worse, while most of America's nuclear defense corridor faced northwards, now Russia could menace the mainland from its unprotected underbelly in the south. This will echo how in MGS3, the nuclear platform, the Shagohod, by way of similarly ingenious innovations, allows MRBMs to fire at a range of ICBMs, and atop a mobile platform, meaning all without silos.
6,000 miles. That's enough to strike anywhere in the United States.
Not only that, with the Shagohod, there's no need to construct giant silos like the ones used to house ICBMs.
The Soviets shipped a total of 5 different types of nuclear weapons to their communist cousins in the Caribbean. First were the 42 SS-4 R-12 medium-range missiles. These pencil-shaped weapons had a max range of 1,292 miles. They were launched from prefabricated firing pads, which were built in advance and, like the warheads themselves, relatively easy to set up and move. Then there were the 32 SS-5 R-14 intermediate-range missiles. 24 of these IMRBMs were set up in Cuba faster than anyone would know it. They guaranteed any direct American action risked the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions. Then there were 6 12-kiloton gravity bombs, meant for the IL-28 planes, also included in the shipment. There were then 12 short-range missiles to be fired from the mobile launch platform known in the East as Luna and the West as FROG, an acronym for Free Rocket Over Ground. These platforms were made famous in many a Soviet parade. Lastly, the Soviets sent 80 LACM land attack cruise missiles. This FKR, or frontline winged rocket, was given alongside 16 launchers and split across 2 divisions. It would take years for this full extent of the nuclear arsenal on Cuba to be known publicly. Why did Khrushchev sneak these weapons onto Cuban shores? Well, to begin with, the same pride he had for Sputnik and the Vostok launch, Khrushchev, perhaps vicariously, took in the victorious revolution of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, the one that had rocked the world in 1959. But apart from this and other reasons, taking a stand against the West in Cuba was also a way of appeasing Khrushchev's harshest critics. The Soviet Union under Premier Khrushchev was trying, however vainly, to change. When he had come to power in 1956, Khrushchev had delivered a shock of his own with the speech on the cult of personality and its consequences. It admitted everything that under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was supposed, even from itself, to repress. Khrushchev called Stalin a totalitarian deviant from the classic Leninist framework. Calling for widespread de-Stalinization, Khrushchev had attempted to set into motion quasi-liberal reforms, which would later be called the Khrushchev Thaw. Ironically, Khrushchev in the East was one of the biggest supporters of the doctrine of peaceful coexistence with the West. He would soon be repeatedly insisting that the purpose of the nukes headed to Cuba were strictly defensive. Survivors of both World War II and the Stalin era, Khrushchev's words and deeds went against the times as most Soviets knew them. That made him many enemies and rivals. Standing up to America was Khrushchev's best hope, perhaps, for placating these critics and hardliners. Yet over in America, in 1960, JFK had won the presidency in large part thanks to calling his own predecessor, Eisenhower, weak-willed when it came to dealing with the triumph of communism over Cuba. Though JFK would be quick to realize the missiles in Cuba were more a political rather than genuine military threat, following the disastrous Bay of Pigs, the president had to look tough on communism. Otherwise, according to the Times, he would likely be rejected as a weak and unfit leader. This was especially worrisome considering 1962 happens also to be a state election year. In short, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev especially want to destroy the world or start a fight. As we'll see, it is the Times themselves that push the situation in Cuba to the absolute brink. Part 2. Guerra Santa, Holy War. The formation of NATO had resulted in more than Russia splitting Germany in two to make a kind of buffer country for the communist bloc. Despite Khrushchev's efforts at a thaw, at mild reform, the threat of Western encroachment NATO posed had led also to a brutal crackdown against Hungary in 1956, stopping a march towards liberal democracy there in its tracks. In the MGS universe, this Soviet counter-revolution was carried out in part by none other than the game's main antagonist, Yevgeny Volgin. Intriguingly, memories of this event in 1979 will inspire aging members of the Soviet Politburo to try the exact same thing, with decidedly different results, in Afghanistan. And this, of course, would provide one of the conflict settings seen in a later MGS, the Phantom Pain. Given Metal Gear Solid 3's interest in the topic of the changing times, something we'll discuss later, it's worth noting also one of the key Soviet commanders, Colonel Dmitry Yazov, would later be named under Mikhail Gorbachev defense minister and play an important role in the 1991 failed coup that will help bring about an end to the Soviet Union. Though in public, the US expressed shock and outrage for Hungary's oppression, in reality JFK was at least a little impressed. In January of 1962, he had told Khrushchev's son-in-law the US could learn a lot from how the Russians had dealt with the unrest. This was an obvious yet veiled reference to America's own little version of Hungary, Cuba. JFK had come to Washington pledging to wage the Cold War alongside what he called the best and the brightest. One such shining star is Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert Strange McNamara. McNamara in turn brought in a handful of young civilian talents, known informally as the Whiz Kids. It's almost certain these Whiz Kids were the inspiration behind MGS3's fresh-faced Unit Fox, who feature mainly young, college-age characters with big ideas like SIGINT and Paramedic. The baby boomers were coming of age. Of course, Fox's XO, Major Zero, is a notable elderly exception. In the MGS universe, this British character helped, alongside the boss, form the legendary outfit and mother of all special forces during World War II, the SAS. After the war, Zero resettled as an expat in Washington, where he joined the so-called Bureau of Classified Planning for the CIA, a name that likely refers to the handle once taken by the CIA's real operational wing, the Directorate of Plans. The boss, meanwhile, had left the SAS during the war to form an elite, literal band of super soldiers, the Cobras. Wielding weaponized parasites that gave them secret powers, the Cobras cut their teeth fighting the Nazis in Stalingrad, right alongside, ironically, fellow patriots like Khrushchev himself. Afterwards, the Cobras were instrumental during the D-Day invasion in attacking V-2 rocket installations along the beach. And ironically, one Soviet weapon on the Cuban island, the nuclear-tipped cruise missiles known as FKR, were really a Russian spin-off of that original Nazi vengeance weapon, the V-1. At the same time, any American invasion of Cuba, which was the likely response once they found out about these missiles, would resemble the Allied storming of Normandy. It would also have to resemble aspects of the Nazi siege on the fortress city of Stalingrad and the Soviet assault on Hungary, too. The snake of history, it seems, lives to eat itself, in a chain reaction of endless battles and repetitions. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the potential of becoming its own version of Hungary, Stalingrad, and Normandy, all coiled into one. Yet none of that will be possible until the US, via aerial reconnaissance, gleans some idea of the nuclear presence on Cuba. The pastime of aerial surveillance had begun with the Napoleonic Wars and came of age during the Pacific War against Japan. But even with the most cutting edge of cameras, photographic intelligence, or photant, was only as good as the analysts deciphering it. For months, the CIA had been hearing rumors and even had caught glimpses of what would turn out to be these Soviet missile shipments to Cuba. But until they got actual photographic evidence, the agency believed the odds of any secret arms deal between Castro and Khrushchev had to be zero. In an ironic yet inverted echo of the agency's rush to accuse Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein of secret nuclear weapons around the release of MGS3 in 2004, the CIA had decided how to read its own intelligence when it came to Cuba in advance. To quote one of my primary sources for this video, 1 Minute to Midnight, As a result, quote, lower-level analysts became reluctant to challenge this opinion, even on the basis of eyewitness reports of missiles being unloaded from Soviet ships, end quote. That gave the Russians time to set things up. But soon enough, the US would find their little secret thanks to aerial photography, as I said, from U-2 spy planes. One reason the CIA initially found the prospect of Soviet nukes on Cuba so hard to believe had to do with security. You'd just have to be nuts to think the Russians would risk sneaking in nuclear weapons by freight liners, especially to a somewhat unadvanced country like Cuba. The journey itself would be a huge risk. Normally, Soviet nukes were carefully routed via train to and from climate-controlled storage sites or testing locations. Cuba had no such storage or infrastructure, and such safety traveling across the ocean was impossible, especially on clandestine ships that were not designed for such cargo. Yet that's exactly what the Soviets did. And according to 1 Minute to Midnight, one freighter in particular, the Alexandrovsk, had on board a concentration of explosive power that exceeded all the bombs dropped in the history of warfare by a factor of at least 3. Imagine if something had happened along the way. En route, the Soviets had to contend also with hurricanes, a lack of water on board, and incredible heat. As a result, many became gravely seasick, and upon arrival they found peace of mind was no more easily obtained on the island than in the sea. Maintaining safe temperature and humidity levels for the nuclear weapons on Cuba without proper housing remained a persistent challenge. One Soviet nuke, fashioned in the mold of the plutonium-type implosion mechanism that had been behind the bomb the US had dropped on Nagasaki, the Fat Man, had been nicknamed, in the Soviets' case, after one of its creator's wives, Tatiana. Meant for the Soviet Il-28 bomber, upon arrival the guarding of the Tatianas, not to mention all the other nuclear weapons, was incredibly poor in Cuba. Yet, ironically, the lack of a secure storage facility or large defense force worked to the Soviets' advantage. It was this very absence of proper measures that made the Soviet emplacements perfectly camouflaged, or nearly so, from aerial recon. Their location, more often than not, simply blended in with the natural environment. You'll recall that in MGS3, the name Tatiana, of course, will be used by the Chinese spy Eva as her Russian cover identity. That name is particularly fitting given her betrayal. The Tatiana is classed as a so-called tactical nuke, meaning one of relatively smaller power to be used in a standalone military conflict, like say on Cuba, as opposed to targeting American civilians in large numbers. The Soviets, while preparing such protocols during the Cold War, tested the Tatiana nuke on their own soldiers in a live fire exercise, ostensibly meant to simulate war conditions against the West. According to 1 Minute to Midnight, 45,000 officers and soldiers were exposed to fallout, and many subsequently died of radiation-related illnesses. Whether in East or West, servicemen who've been exposed to fallout or radiation are known as atomic veterans. What really makes the name Tatiana perfect for Eva is how similarly this story of her namesake resembles the nuclear tests that Snake was exposed to on the Marshall Islands, which is where he joined the boss as one of these atomic veterans. The extent to which real American servicemen were intentionally exposed to radiation, like their Soviet counterparts, is unknown. But another connection to MGS3 is simply how much, for both the Soviets and the American proxies on the island, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a fight between East and West, but against man and nature. Just like their Soviet counterparts, these CIA-trained anti-Castro guerrillas, like the ones from the spy network codenamed Cobra, were on a mission to sneak behind enemy lines across vast stretches of wilderness, dealing along the way with heavy rainfall along dense mangrove swamps. All of this, of course, would feature prominently in the design of MGS3. The Soviets, meanwhile, far less familiar with the terrain than the Cuban-American proxies, had to deal with a host of further foreign threats. from poisonous trees and snakes to dysentery from spoiled food to a lack of water. Their missiles, meanwhile, remained hidden beneath lush jungle camouflage or deep within mountain redoubts. From the air, American spy planes began to discover more and more clues that the situation in Cuba was not only going nuclear, it was much worse than anyone yet dared to believe. As CIA analysts pored over every aerial photo, at this time East and West had yet to establish reliable and fast back channels for direct communication. The Soviets and Americans, as a result, viewed each other as mutually assured mysteries. What the Americans failed to realize was the Soviets and Cubans were preparing, in the likely event of an all-out American invasion as the crisis went public, to hit the US naval facility at Guantanamo Bay with a nuclear strike. All those nukes and Soviet personnel were being ferried to a militarized, galvanized Cuba, where revolutionaries like Che Guevara hyped the populace with slogans like "Motherland or Death," "Patria o Muerte," and "Venceremos, we will win." What little Cubans knew about mass destruction they had learned from movies. Che had famously once quipped, "In revolution, you win or you die." The Cubans were ready to die, if necessary, no less ardently than the Americans, as they began to learn of the nuclear threat on the island, were readying to invade. This brings up the prime importance during the Cold War, perhaps for the first time, of perception and politics over genuine military considerations. Though the facility at Guantanamo Bay posed an immediate danger to Castro, for example, he could not risk attacking, not without a nuclear deterrent of his own. As the secret plot to sneak nukes into Cuba and grab the US's leadership by the balls was gradually exposed, Kennedy first needed a viable pretext to present, both domestically and on the world stage, to justify an invasion. His administration decided first to simply close off Cuba with a naval blockade, publicly called, for propaganda purposes, a quarantine. By calling it a quarantine and not blockade, legally speaking, the White House was signaling this was not yet officially a state of war. Then, over the Russian delegates' protests, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson delivered a dramatic and historic presentation to the United Nations, proving the Soviet concealment plot before the world. This effectively hijacked the narrative. Khrushchev, in the name of defending Cuba's popular revolution from Western imperialism, had hoped to announce the nukes only once they were already securely in place. Instead, by getting spotted mid-operation, Khrushchev now lost whatever leverage he might have hoped to gain from it. By triggering an alert, Khrushchev also inadvertently put the reputations of both himself and JFK, not to mention the fate of the entire world, on the line. First, Khrushchev wrote a letter saying to remove the weapons from Cuba, all he needed was America's commitment never to invade the island. That was on October 26th, 15 days since the start of the crisis. But one day later, a second letter arrived. This time, Khrushchev said he also needed a pledge for the US to remove those Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy could sense that this change was in order to appease the hardliners in Russia. As a result, in secret, the two superpowers agreed that both weapon installations would be removed. But JFK did not allow the public to know the Turkish missiles were part of the bargain, lest he look weak on the world stage. But none of that resolution would take place until the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis passed, on October 27th, known as Black Saturday.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill. I'm searching and I'll melt into you. What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme. I give my life, not for honor, but for you. In my time, there'll be no one else crime. It's the way I fly to you. I'm still in a dream, snake eater. I'm still in a dream, snake eater.
It was the perfect storm. Several serious events occurred at once, each of them enough to risk all-out nuclear war. A U-2 spy plane piloted by one Charles F. Maltzby took off from Ellison Air Force Base in Alaska at 4 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, midnight Alaska. His destination? The North Pole. In this era, it was normal for American pilots to hunt for Russian surface-to-air or SAM installations by pinpricks to the Russian perimeter. Getting close enough would cause the Soviets to flip on their anti-air capabilities, on which the Americans, by SIGINT or signals intelligence, could then get an approximate fix. This was often how the West figured out the East's defenses. Other times, U-2 spy planes would be used instead for collecting samples of high-altitude radiation in the wake of a Soviet atmospheric test. And this was just such a mission. Typically, the pilot's way home would be guided by the constellations. But on this fateful morning, Maltzby was blinded by a familiar sight for fans of MGS3 and the opening of Operation Snake Eater, an aurora borealis. As Maltzby struggled to read the stars, his spy plane strayed far into Soviet territory. And as Russian MiG fighters were scrambled to intercept, F-102 interceptors set off to defend him. They took off from where Snake ends up at the end of the game, Galena Air Force Base, Alaska. And as they tore across the skies beneath them in the Alaskan frigid water, nuclear submarines like the one that the boss is said to use at the start of MGS3 patrolled silently, ready to launch at any time. Now normally the F-102s in the air would be fitted with standard air-to-air rockets, but this was happening after, on October 24th, 3 days prior, the US military had responded to the Cuban Missile Crisis by entering Defense Readiness Condition or DEFCON 2, one step away from a state of all-out nuclear war. That meant this morning the F-102s came armed with nuclear spear tips. If there had been any minor confrontation, it would have meant the end of the world. This event was effectively covered up by the Kennedy administration. It remains classified top secret by the US Air Force even today. Around the same time, in Cuba itself, Black Saturday marked the climax of tensions between East and West, as a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down and killed a U-2 pilot. Even more horrifyingly, the decision to do so was made unilaterally by Soviets in the field. The predefined response by the US in the face of such an attack was unambiguous. Normally, it would mean a retaliatory strike on the SAM site in question, but that, of course, in Cuba's case, would likely lead to war. With the acceleration to DEFCON 3, then 2, to quote 1 Minute to Midnight, the number of bombers on airborne alert increased fivefold. Strategic Air Command had more planes and missiles and warheads on alert than at any time in its history. Castro had been fooled by the Soviet boasts of its considerable nuclear arsenal. He did not know that Russia knew it lacked the weapons to destroy the American supply of nukes completely. To make the first strike was a death sentence, in other words, and really no wide-scale thermonuclear war was, for the Soviet Union, survivable, let alone winnable. The whole logic of the crisis had been built around deterrence, of preventing the US from Cuban intervention, yet ironically both an American assault and wide-scale nuclear holocaust were now more likely than they had ever been. It's important to note that Castro and the US had been engaged in all but open hostilities, more or less, ever since their falling out became total in January 1961. While America sent in CIA-trained Cuban exiles to sabotage Castro's government in the ongoing covert campaign Operation Mongoose, Castro, beginning in February 1962, began to agitate for further guerrilla war against American imperialism all across Latin America. It was hardly a climate that afforded peaceful coexistence. By Black Saturday, more firepower was trained and ready to fire on the U.S. from Cuba than had ever been exploded in human history. The R-12 missile could travel 1,292 miles. The city of Manhattan, meanwhile, was just 2 miles less than that. In short, the Soviet nukes were meant not to be fired, but to challenge America psychologically. Kennedy's blockade, meanwhile, was also not really about attacking Soviet ships, but pressuring Russia to relent. Both superpowers were acting out a kabuki theater show, yet both Kennedy and Khrushchev began to realize a real danger now existed for events to spiral well out of either leader's power to control. This would be the closest the East and West would come to all-out nuclear war. Nuclear weapons of both East and West were now in the field. Any slight accident or misunderstanding threatened triggering a chain reaction whose flames would surely engulf the world. Yet both superpowers, in lieu of direct contact, had only the word of spies, analysts, diplomats, and the news media with which to calibrate. Fortunately for the US, a Soviet double agent named Oleg Penkovsky provided more than enough technical intel on the Soviets' weapons platforms. But as the American public began to gain some idea of the imminent threat now before them, it was clear this was like no crisis before. Though the fate of the entire world hanged in the balance, nobody could tell the public what was actually going on. There was no front to report from, no known public development for that matter to report. In this, the shadowy era of the Cold War, the public found it was now largely flying blind. And even now, nearly 60 years later, most Americans simply have no idea just how close things came to the end of the world. The Soviets in Cuba had long-distance nukes for striking the American homeland, but also mid-range ones aimed at Guantanamo Bay, and short-range ones on the Luna platforms ready to annihilate any invasion force. Whether to fire the first nuke to begin World War III also now, briefly, became a decision entrusted to countless individual pilots and commanders, rather than remaining solely the purview of the High Command. Normally, America's nukes utilized a strict protocol of the buddy system, requiring the input of 2 different servicemen to launch. Further, electronic locks, the precursors to the permissive action link technology featured in Metal Gear Solid 1, prevented unauthorized use. The president, technically a civilian officer, maintained through such safeguards the principle of command and control. The decision to use these weapons needed to come not from the military, but from him and him alone. The Cuban Missile Crisis made such complete command and control impossible, though. Getting nuclear bombers like the F-100 Super Sabre in the air so suddenly meant JFK could not afford to rely on only the planes with those locks installed, or those with multiple pilots. Ultimately, many different soldiers and pilots would briefly have access to nuclear weapons throughout the incident. Though nothing happened, the crisis clarified the necessity for greater command and control mechanisms. The plot of MGS3, meanwhile, would revolve around the exact same danger of rogue unilateral use of a tactical nuclear weapon in the field that the Cuban Missile Crisis first established as a plausible threat. And even if nobody started Armageddon intentionally, there was now also the chance for a serious and tragic accident, starting a runaway chain reaction. When the North American Aerospace Defense Command NORAD had to suddenly position nuclear bombers in airfields across the country, many of these airfields weren't built for them. During a simple accident landing his F-106, an American pilot nearly blew his nuclear payload up. Who knows what catastrophe this would have caused? The Cuban Missile Crisis contains many near-miss stories like this one. The crisis is also full of stories like The Bosses, stories where, to quote again from 1 Minute to Midnight, as usual, the failure of the mission was blamed on the men who had risked their lives to implement it, rather than the admirals or apparatchiks who made a mess of the planning. But the most important one has to be that during Black Saturday of Soviet submariner Vasily Arkhipov. An American vessel tried to signal to his crew to surface using non-lethal depth charges. This was misinterpreted by the team on board the Soviet submarine as the breakout of open hostilities. And the Russians on board already had permission to use their secret 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo without checking with the Kremlin first. Though others on board wanted desperately to fire, Arkhipov remained calm and refused. It's possible his bravery and wisdom in such a dire situation at least somewhat inspired the MGS3 character, the boss. And it certainly saved the world. Nuclear brinkmanship between the superpowers and the risks that are entailed has defined the Metal Gear series from the very start. In many respects, the Cuban Missile Crisis is exactly the kind of nightmare scenario these games have always warned about. But you'll remember the unique focus for MGS3 in particular is on the times, that living human superstructure that, according to Snake Eater, really steers world events, dictates politics, and determines friend from foe. The times and vain struggles against them define the Missile Crisis of October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is so important to MGS3, it's actually made part of the game's story, a kind of overture to MGS3's prologue. The codename Snake Eater from the game is reminiscent of the name given by the CIA to its covert attempts to subvert and even assassinate Fidel Castro that played a hand in causing the Cuban Missile Crisis, Operation Mongoose. The game's plot involves stopping the proliferation of Soviet nuclear weapons technology across the developing world, where it might wind up in the hands, say, of dictators. This mirrors to some extent the events of the Missile Crisis, which suddenly saw a small regional power like Cuba gaining the deterrent force of the Soviet Union. One ship that served as a dramatic point of contention regarding the American blockade had a familiar name for MGS fans, Grozny. At first, Khrushchev, despite having his plot exposed to the world, refused to back down. This meant the ships heading towards the blockade would not be called back. The Grozny was an 8,000-ton vessel that, though the CIA knew actually had nothing to do with the missile shipment, nonetheless was chosen to be made an example of, to prove to the world America's strength, that it meant what it said about stopping Soviet ships from entering Cuban waters. Like we see in MGS3 when it comes to the boss and her secret mission to quote-unquote prove America's innocence, often making a big public statement during the Cold War was much more important than what really went on behind closed doors, and often contradicted reality. The US hunted feverishly for the Grozny until they found the ship coming right up to the quarantine zone, where it then stopped just before dawn on the day after Black Saturday, October 28th. As it became impossible to continue the campaign of denial and deception, Khrushchev decided to backpedal, but only in a way that would mask his blunder as a success. Simply put, he had read the Americans wrong. Their gradually apparent preparations to invade Cuba now threw Khrushchev a major curveball. He simply didn't think that the Americans had it in them. Now the Soviets would claim the whole affair all along had really been about forcing America into swearing never to invade Cuba. In exchange, or so went the story the Kremlin would present for public consumption, their missiles would gladly be removed. In the end, Khrushchev blinked, calling back the Soviet convoys before full-scale war could break out. As the US pledged never to invade Cuba, East and West also formally established a direct line of communication, known in popular culture ever since as the Red Telephone. Overall, the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that the so-called peace of the Cold War would inevitably introduce nuclear weapons into conflict regions worldwide, and not merely within the borders of Russia or the USA. But the times were already beginning to change, coiling in on themselves like a snake. By the Cold War's end, the fight between East and West would be over, but the nuclear weapons the politics of that period had allowed to proliferate as their legacy would still remain in existence. If this video get 30,000 views in the first 2 weeks, we'll return with even more analysis of MGS3 and the Cold War. Until next time, boss.